And now I'd like to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Professor Carl Fisher, the chair of the Comparative World Literature Program here at California State University, Long Beach. Carl?
Ken. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started so that we don't interrupt the speakers. If you could remember to turn off your cell phones, pagers, and electronic devices. In fact, I should remember to turn off mine. When leaving for class, because I know some of you will have 12:30 class, please try to exit quietly. We have an interpreter for each session, and reserved seating is available in front for those of you who are hearing impaired, and we want to extend our appreciation for their support. And books by the authors will be sold in the lobby after the session. Okay. Our topic today is the freedom to write and publish within the larger conference topic of international human rights, exploring challenges to free expression and belief. The permissible limits of expression remains a vitally important topic, pertinent and relevant. Our freedom of expression is a precious aspect which we assume is protected, but often it can be remarkably fragile. Controlling discourse is an important aspect of the intellectual, psychological, and emotional tenor of a time. It is clear that writers and artists in general embody a threat, and weapons can be used against free expression that are sometimes subtle and sometimes blunt. From the self-policing that's expected of people, to direct censorship, to violence for the expression of beliefs, often imprisonment, torture, even assassination. This problem is not new. The drive to suppress and censor is almost as old as writing itself. Plato's Republic from 360 BC famously argues that poets must be exiled because artistic creativity is a danger to social control. Whatever we might argue about the seriousness of Plato's argument, and it's ambiguous in places, it shows us how seriously he takes writing. Free expression uses words as weapons, and almost as long as there's been written expression, writing has been a threatening and a threatened enterprise. Important for the development of community, creativity, and any kind of sociability, expression works as a balance and a counterpoint to social and political struggle and to the monolithic voices of authority. Nor has the problem gone away, whether it's classical times or contemporary. The modern world, the world in which we live, has many notorious examples of the suppression and censorship of free expression. Salman Rushdie and the fatwa against his writing after the Satanic Verses, Orhan Pamuk, for example, running afoul of Turkish authorities and speaking about genocide. Russian author and journalist Anna Politkovskaya, gunned down in her Moscow apartment within the last few years. Free expression is very risky, and in some cases, it can be a matter of life and death. But writers continue to write and to find an audience that's hungry for knowledge, information, and interpretation of the world. Heinrich Heine, a 19th century German romantic poet, wrote a play called Almansor in 1821, in which one of the characters talks about the fact that during the Spanish Inquisition, many books were burned, and one of the books that was particularly condemned was the Quran. Of course, it was one of the tricks that writers used because he wasn't really writing about the Spanish Inquisition. He was writing about the rise of German nationalism in the early 19th century and the parochial views that fueled censorship and the fact that authorities at the time in the 1820s were burning books. And he said famously in a phrase that's much quoted when we think back to the Nazis and their censorship in the 30s and 40s and more, of course. He said, first they will burn books, then they will burn people. The idea that writing is so dangerous permeates the work of the writers that are speaking today. Each of them is immersed in the issues of human rights and creative expression from personal experience and as informed witnesses of local and global attempts to fight the problems of repression and censorship. In their written work and in their public careers, they narrate tales of trauma and violation, but also of hope and of a hope for the future. They speak for the voiceless and the repressed, and each brings a unique sense of the personal as well as the universal to the topic at hand. They focus often on specific places and times, but with universal implications. And so that each of them will be able to speak in a kind of a fluid way, I'm going to introduce our three panelists now and let them get up on their own. Alicia Portnoy will be our first speaker. Alicia is a poet, academic, translator, and human rights activist who is among 30,000 Argentinians who were disappeared after a military coup in 1976. She was secretly imprisoned for 2.5 years from 1977 to 1979, during which time she was tortured. Following her release, Portnoy claimed asylum in the U.S., where she still lives and works. She's an associate professor and a chair at Loyola Marymount University. Following her release, Portnoy claimed asylum in the U.S. She's been very active in testifying before international human rights organizations against those involved in military dictatorship. At the time of her disappearance, Portnoy was a student of literature and a member of the Peronist youth movement, clandestinely collecting and disseminating information about repression. On January 12, 1977, she was arrested by the army along with her infant daughter. She was imprisoned at a concentration camp known as La Escuelita, or the Little School, where dissidents were taught their lessons, in other words, tortured. After 3 months, she was moved to prison, where she spent a total of 2.5 years without charge or trial. During this time, she was separated from her child, yet she managed to smuggle out stories and poems which were published anonymously. Portnoy's first book, The Little School, Tales of Disappearance and Survival in Argentina, provides a glimpse into her life as a blindfolded, disappeared person. And she has continued to work on the behalf of human rights. She's testified before the United Nations, the Organization of American States, Amnesty International, and the Argentine Human Rights Commission. And we're very lucky to have her as all our panelists today. Larry Seams is a poet, a journalist, and a human rights activist as well. He has BA degrees in English and Classical Greek from the University of Notre Dame and an MFA in poetry from Columbia University. He has taught literature and writing at both the high school and the university level. He's written extensively on immigration and cross-cultural issues. His book, Between the Lines, Letters Between Undocumented Mexicans and Central Americans and Their Families and Friends, was a finalist for the Penn West Award for Nonfiction in 1993. His work on the U.S. border led to a position at Human Rights Watch, where he researched and co-wrote the America's Watch report, Brutally Unchecked, Human Rights Abuses Along the Mexican-U.S. Border, and later to an individual project fellowship from the Open Society Institute to study immigration politics. He joined Penn American Center in 2001 as director of its Freedom to Write and international programs, following 5 years as director of Freedom to Write program at Penn USA West in Los Angeles. At Penn American Center, he's responsible for ongoing efforts to defend writers facing persecution for their work around the world, and for Penn's campaign for Core Freedoms, a comprehensive initiative to turn back new threats to freedom of expression in the United States. Our third speaker will be Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a novelist, essayist, playwright, journalist, editor, and social activist. He's currently Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Director of the International Center for Writing and Translation at the University of California at Irvine. His novels have been translated into more than 30 languages. His work has been extremely influential as a force in how we understand the transition from the colonial world to post-coloniality. The Kenya of his birth and youth was a British colony. As an adolescent, he lived through the Mau Mau War of Independence, the central historical episode in the making of modern Kenya, and a major theme in his early works. Petals of Blood, which was published in 1977, painted a harsh portrait. I've lost a page somewhere in there. Paints a very harsh portrait of the human rights situation in Kenya. And during his time, he was imprisoned. He was repressed. He was forced into exile. One time when he was on a book tour and working with a play in England, he found that there was an assassination attempt awaiting him if he returned to Kenya. And he has spent the better part of the last 20 years working abroad in England and then in the United States, and he continues to be a very prolific writer on the issues that we're facing today in terms of human rights, censorship, and freedom of expression. So with that background, I would like to introduce Alicia Partnoy and let her speak.
Hola, buenos días. Bueno, ¿cuántos hablan español aquí? Oh, okay, so I can speak in Spanish all the way. Don't freak out. Thank you. Thanks. It's a great honor to be on this panel at this event. I could like to go beyond the usual suspects as we examine the factors that threaten state terrorism, survivors' freedom to write and publish. And my idea is to discuss this notion of being the voice for the voiceless. And I'm glad that Professor Fisher mentioned that, because it's a very common assumption that we writers who are survivors, or any writers who are in solidarity, will become the voice for the voiceless. I think that is a binding proposition, and I'm using the term as binding, something that ties you and limits your space and the space of the survivors to develop their own stories. And binding because then you get to be a bound author if you abide with this proposition to become the voice for the voiceless. You might end up being published and famous, and your work will be, recognized. In the United States, for the past 30 years, the crimes against humanity committed by dictatorships in Latin America have been at the center of many college courses. Survivors and their words have become the object of intense scrutiny, and interest in human rights organizations like the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo has generated a high number of proposals to travel and interview them, to write fiction, poetry, to paint murals, to produce documentaries based on their experience, and to research into their struggle and their history. These activities have contributed to disseminate information about human rights violations, and in many instances, they have empowered survivors as they build solidarity around their causes. However, more often than not, the needs and agendas of scholars, writers, and artists prevail over those of the testimonial subject. Testimonial subject is the survivor who tells the story. It could be someone who has been a victim of state terrorism or abuse, or it can be what I call the extended victim, which is the relatives of those. The Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, have any of you studied about them? These are the women who marched across the street from the government house in Argentina during the time of the dictatorship, and they're still marching and claiming, trying to find out the whereabouts of the 30,000 disappeared, among them their own children. When I was in the concentration camp in Argentina, in the secret detention place, the little school, the mothers started to march. And they were instrumental for my freedom. They called a lot of international attention on the case of Argentina. The situation of having the agendas of scholars, of writers, of professionals in the world of the human rights prevail or rule over the agendas of the survivors and the witnesses can be tolerated in moments of tremendous crisis, when assassinations, disappearances, and torture are taking place. Then, in their desperation to build a discourse of solidarity, survivors make many concessions, even when they realize that they are seen as native informants and their agency is wrestled from them. If what is at stake is to stop the killings, They might yield to the interests of writers, scholars, publishers. Important aspects of this problematic have been illuminated by Doris Sommer when she warns us to, and this is the title of her book, proceed with caution when engaged by minority writing in the Americas. If intellectuals insist on characterizing the testimonial subject as an object, then the waters of their understanding will appear murky. Furthermore, we are only helping their victimizers to silence survivors if we keep believing that others need to speak for them and that the truth as it is understood in the world of academia or by the publishing industry should be the central concern of survivors when engaging in the production of testimonial texts. Let's take the case of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. These women engaged in a strong resistance to the messianic discourse of power that sought to erase the disappeared from history and collective consciousness. Most of their activities have been documented and analyzed by scholars in Argentina and abroad, but their writing remain among the most neglected aspects of their work. Perhaps this failure to recognize their contributions as authors is a consequence of the academic construction of knowledge. To see the mothers as both victims and also as authors, as objects of repression and as narrators of their own lives, introduces fissures in the traditional flow of discourse. The difficulty in overcoming these gaps demonstrates one of the most vulnerable aspects of a critical project dedicated to building a discourse of solidarity, the intersection between academic, literary culture, and the people's culture. Hierarchical relationships tend to be an extremely strong feature of academia and of the world of letters in general. To empower the mothers, we have to make efforts to see them as subjects and not just objects of our scholarly or literary endeavors. We must listen to their words and their ideas, read their writings. Maybe then we could venture an answer to Porota, P-O-R-O-T-A, Porota's question in the book, The Heart in the Writing, con el corazón en la escritura. And she said, who would have expected that we would get involved in the struggle? Who would have expected that we would write? And now, who would want to read us now? And this is part of my an article that has been published, and it deals with 4 of the narrative books by mothers of the disappeared in Argentina. Matilde Melibovsky's Circle of Love Over Death. Matilde Melibovsky, Circle of Love Over Death, is the only one that has been translated into English of those 4 works. If any of you wants more information on that, please approach me. Unfortunately, the truths that the publishing industry wants from survivors are restricted to certain recipes for mass consumption and aiming for the coveted movie deal. They are the kind of truths most easily produced by fiction writers. The industry should not be surprised, therefore, when the works it finds appealing and publishable are totally fabricated. As in the case of Consequences, Margaret Jones Seltzer's book, I don't know if you followed that scandal, or James Frey's A Million Little Pieces, the guy that Oprah chopped into pieces. Remember that? The backlash of Frey's scandal was soon felt by no other than Elie Wiesel. It was painful to watch the spectacle of his wife and translator justifying the changes in her own translation of Night. You've read Night, most of you probably. Marion Wiesel told the New York Times that her husband had made a mistake in the first version of his memoir. He had stated that he was almost 15 when entering the Birkenau concentration camp, while in reality, he was about to turn 16. And I'm quoting, "At no point did this change the meaning and the fact of anything in the book," Mrs. Wiesel said, and quote again, "When I worked on the book, I kidded Ellie and told him, I don't think you can add." Deborah Lipstadt and other scholars have analyzed the ways Holocaust deniers have seized those kinds of mistakes as opportunities. The attempts to tarnish the reputation of Nobel Prize laureate and survivor Rigoberta Menchú and the subsequent debate in the academic world are carefully outlined by Guatemalan writer and scholar Arturo Arias in the book, The Rigoberta Menchú Controversy. One might spend long pages speculating on the reasons for Elie Wiesel and other survivors to make what the publishing world and academia perceive as unforgivable mistakes in the recollection of their stories. Those imprecisions just illustrate that the care for certain details demanded before a court of law is not exercised by former victims when producing testimonial texts. Memories can be freer as they circulate in friendlier territories populated by sympathetic listeners and potential allies. Those listeners and readers, you, enter a solidarity pact with the narrators. They trust their sincerity, which is different from expecting the truth. More often than not, a narrator's main allegiance is with the other victims, seeking to protect their dignity and agency. Some truths may not need disclosure in order to accomplish these goals. It is true that our telling, our writing can and will make us vulnerable unless a discourse of solidarity is built around our words. Too often, personal research agendas and professional or financial demands prevent the best-intentioned people from truly listening to survivors. Then I propose we propose two little ways. It's not that I invented or reinvented the wheel. They've been done. Gugi here is, our teacher in these endeavors. But I propose we continue engaging in something I call co-labor actions that are innovative, non-logocentric, non-hierarchical models of research, creative production, and action. Co-labor actions might be messy. The voices of the so-called voiceless might take over the page. I'm not sure the writers are as ready for that as they are when they're writing their novels. Have you heard the writers who are writing their novels and they said, oh, the characters just did whatever they wanted. I had planned something for them, but they took over and what happens if in the cases, like in books by Elena Poniatowska or Claribel Alegría, for those, Poniatowska, Poniatowska, or Claribel Alegría, those women tend to collect those voices and have a saying from the survivors in there. And it becomes messy. Those voices can take over. But if we cannot afford the risks that the model poses to our professional advancement, we should at least be aware of the risks that those we claim to represent face in our hands as writers, as scholars. The same technology that allows us to feel, borrowing Elaine Zali's words, at home in cyberspace, might help us bring to the discussion table many potential partners in collaborative action projects, an alternative but complementary approach that could empower survivors as it empowered women and minorities in this country would be an affirmative action position. So what we are doing here in this panel is an affirmative action position. We have at least 2 survivors. I don't know about you, you probably survived. If you were in the border, you probably survived or were thrown in jail a couple of times. But that's an affirmative action position in this panel. Okay, most conferences that discuss our writings or survivors' lives and how to proceed to stop state terrorism do not involve victims as part of the thinkers, survivors as part of the thinkers. So this affirmative action calls for this inclusion, and it will allow survivors to circulate freely in the professional worlds that feed on their telling. It can help them dismantle the myth that they need to be spoken for, that someone else has to write their stories, their poems, their testimonial texts, that someone else has to carry on the duty to protect and disseminate their truth. Donna Stanton has addressed this issue in the MLA newsletter, for those of you who are in my field. And there was a conference, Human Rights and the Humanities, an MLA conference. And she highlighted the new developments that since the 70s have led us to increasingly reject, and I'm quoting her, an imperial humanitarian voice speaking and acting for oppressed others in favor of now speaking with them as agents in their own right, unquote. Today, speaking with is still largely understood not as a joint act of addressing the audience, but as reporting unilaterally the results of that conversation. As long as the act of speaking with does not disclose in the final resort what words and concepts were contributed by the other to the debate, the prepositional shift may be rendered obsolete. When considering the contributions of testimonial subjects who have survived the repression, a verb shift from speaking to listening might prove useful. However, in the case of those who have not survived, we can only speak without them. Mexican author and intellectual Rosario Castellanos' wisdom can lead us in that quest. More than 30 years ago, she wrote in the poem, The Return, El Retorno. So then, they do not ask me to live for them, to see the world they do not see, to body forth a destiny left incomplete. If I need justification for existing, for doing, and above all, for not erasing myself, which would be logical based on the evidence, I will have to obtain it some other way. I'm going to end with that poem in Spanish, that quote from Rosario Castellanos, for those of you who were forced by your professors to come to this lecture because you're in the Spanish department. Así pues, no me piden que yo viva por ellos, que mire el mundo que no ven, que lleve adelante un destino que no alcanzó a cumplirse. Si necesito justificaciones para estar, para ser y sobre todo para no borrarme, que sería lo lógico siguiendo las premisas, habrá que conseguirlas de otro modo. Gracias.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It is such a great honor to be sitting next to 2 of my heroes on this panel, and to be back in California, it's just fabulous. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the freedom to write as it is around the world right now. And I want to start by the thing that I do every time I sit down as a writer, which is really ask myself, ask all of us, what we mean when we talk about the freedom to write. And I think the best way to do it is to think about it the way I do when I sit down, which is I pick up my pen and I think, what could I write right now, today, that would get me killed? Right? What could I write right now, today, that would get me arrested? What could I write that would get me beaten up or threatened by somebody? What could I write that would get me ostracized from my friends or whatever, right? And the answer to those questions, right, those are the barriers, those are the censorship forces that are at work on me. And we all have them. And you know, I would have to say that in my work at Penn, I've watched as the answers to those, the list of answers to those questions has grown over the last 7 or 8 years. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that today. Penn is an organization that exists to promote the freedom to write around the world. And we don't just do it from the United States. We're really, truly an international organization. We have 145 Penn centers in 102 countries right now. One of the most interesting ones is in China. There are about 250 dissident writers inside of China and outside of China that have formed a Penn Center. They did this in 2001. It's called the Independent Chinese Penn Center. And they're doing just frontline, cutting-edge freedom of expression defense work in China. They're bloggers, they're independent journalists, they're poets, they're academics, they're critics. And they're doing this under constant pressure from the government. For instance, every year they have an annual dinner where they give awards, Freedom to Write Awards in China. Pretty provocative thing to do. They give them to Chinese writers. In 2007, the Chinese government shut down their dinner. They started calling the members. There had been no public announcement of this, but they started calling the members because, of course, everybody's phone is tapped, and telling them that they can't go to this meeting. They got the hotel to cancel the meeting. They posted guards outside of all of the officers' houses, and they detained the 2 people who were going to get awards at that meeting. They just shut it down. Well, over the last year, because this was the year that the Olympics were in China, we worked with the center because the Chinese government had promised that in order to get the Olympics, they specifically promised that they would increase and promote human rights in China. So we worked with the Independent Chinese Penn Center. We had a campaign to expand the freedom of expression, the freedom to write in China. And I have to say we weren't very successful. There were 14 writers arrested over the past year in China, 12 of them in the weeks before the Olympics. And then since the Olympics, Liu Xiaobo, and I sent around this postcard, Liu Xiaobo was the founding president of the Independent Chinese Penn Center. He was president from 2003 to 2007, one of China's most famous dissident writers. He worked with some other writers this past fall to write something called Charter 08. It's a petition, it's sort of a manifesto for greater political political freedoms and human rights in China. Liu Xiaobo was arrested the day before the petition was to be made public on International Human Rights Day on December 12th. He's being held without charge or trial in a hotel. This is what they often do to dissidents, sort of a house, a residential arrest. But he will likely be charged with subversion and sentenced to 3 years in prison. If you can take a second and fill out this postcard and send it to Washington, just to the consulate there, and then to go to the Penn website and sign the petition there, I would be really grateful. Now, Hillary Clinton just went to China this past week, a little over a week ago. And we were very hopeful, right? This is a new moment for the United States, the first sort of the new face of the new administration in the world. We had hoped that she would raise Liu Xiaobo's name. He's an extraordinarily important and famous person. His detention is obviously a very discouraging sign about China's respect for human rights. Well, what did Hillary do? While she was there, by the way, several Independent Chinese Penn Center members were detained to prevent them from going and meeting with her. They had guards posted outside the door. They got phone calls. But the Secretary of State did not mention human rights publicly while she was in China. In fact, she said, we know what the Chinese are going to say. There's not much to do about it. We're not going to let human rights stand in the way of the business that we need to do right now with China. That was a really discouraging moment for me. You know, we had seen of course, what the damage to the United States reputation that the previous administration had done. We were torturing people Obviously, that was a problem. But we were also restricting freedom of information and freedom of expression in the United States. So we knew that when we went back out there in the world, we were going to take some heat for it. But we expected that we would go back out there and announce that this was once again a priority for us. Just some of the things that were happening in the United States over the last 8 years that related to the freedom to write and the freedom of expression in the United States that I think the rest of the world can legitimately point to as a bad example. I'll just give you 3 anecdotes, 3 kinds of examples. The first thing is something that we call ideological exclusion, and it's something that the United States did during the Cold War, which is identify foreign writers and scholars whose ideas we don't like and not let them come to the United States, so that Americans can't hear their ideas or their voices. We're a very isolated country, and if you block these people at the border, it becomes much more difficult for the United States citizens to interact with these ideas. There's a famous Turkish sociologist named Haluk Gerger who writes about the Kurds in Turkey. And like most people who wrote about the Kurds in Turkey in the 1990s, he went to jail several times for doing it. And he went to jail under anti-terrorism laws in Turkey that say that that's incitement to terrorism because you're supporting the Turks. Now, during the 1990s, the United States openly supported him. They listed him in the State Department country reports as an example of somebody who the governments were misusing national security laws to suppress freedom of expression. And then in 1999, when he went back on trial, the US gave him a 10-year visa, open-ended visa to come to the United States whenever he wanted, a big public gesture of solidarity. Well, he and his wife got on a plane on October 1st, 2002 and flew to Newark Airport and arrived and were told that their visas had been canceled and they were sent back to Turkey. No explanation was given, but clearly what happened was that because he had been convicted of a terrorism-related crime in another country, he was suddenly ineligible to come to the United States. The United States has kept 250 foreign scholars and writers from coming to the United States since 9/11, strictly because their views were not favored by the administration. So they were controlling discourse by keeping antagonistic voices out. Inside of the United States, they were controlling information for, by example, prohibiting photographs of coffins of returning servicemen, of dead servicemen from Afghanistan and Iraq. And then, interestingly, after Hurricane Katrina, the FEMA issued an order that was going to prohibit news photographers from taking pictures of dead bodies, that they were going to prohibit the media from photographing dead bodies in New Orleans. And I got a phone call from Reuters right after that happened, and they asked Penn for a comment, and I said, well, obviously, I don't see how you can report a story whose subject is death without showing images of death. We report disasters around the world, and we show images of death. It seems like we ought to be able to do that at home. And within a half an hour of that being posted on the Reuters website, I started to get angry emails from all across the country that accused me of being insensitive, and to the point of saying that I got threats saying, it should be you and your family that are floating in the floodwaters of New Orleans. And they had picked up this kind of argument that was being promoted in the right-wing blogs that said that this is not a question of freedom of information. This is a question of sensitivity to the families. So we were cloaking this kind of censorship under the pretext of being sensitive. This is crucial information, obviously, the public had a right to know. But in fact, during the same period of time, there was actually specific pressure being exerted on journalists themselves who were covering the government's own programs. I'll just give you one example. Brian Ross, who's the reporter for ABC News, he and his partner Richard Esposito had worked on some of the stories about CIA secret prisons in Europe. And in May of 2006, he got a phone call from somebody inside the CIA inside the FBI, saying, the government knows who you're talking to. They know who your sources are. And they know this because they've got your phone records. So you should know this, and you might want to go out and get some new cell phones in somebody else's name. You might not want to use this. So, and the argument was that they were trying to stop the leaks coming from inside the government. But these are illegal programs that the United States citizens should have a right to know about. Brian Ross said, this makes reporting very, very difficult. You start thinking like some sort of mafia capo. You make your phone calls with bags of quarters at payphones if you can find a payphone anymore. But that same summer, there were members of Congress who were calling for prosecutions of journalists under the Espionage Act, prosecutions of New York Times journalists and Washington Post journalists who had broken stories about torture and about the US NSA surveillance program. And Congress passed a resolution saying it expects the cooperation of all news organizations in protecting the president's anti-terror plans. And that's the most Soviet-sounding kind of declaration you can possibly imagine. We now know that how illegal some of these programs are, and there have been some improvements, right? We have the executive orders ending torture, banning torture, and ordering the closing of Guantanamo. Just this past week, a new policy on that the press is allowed to publish photographs of coffins of returning service people. There's much more information about these secret programs, a much more lively debate. But now we send Hillary out into the world for the first time to sort of see where we are, to take the temperature of where we are. And what's really concerning to me is that the world she's moving into has slid significantly in terms of the freedom to write during that 8-year period. And it's slid because I think I'm just going to give 3 quick examples of major problems that we have, trends around the world that are threatening the freedom to write, and how they were sort of exacerbated by the US during that time. The first one is what we call the rise of non-state actors. I just mentioned Mexico as a country. 37 journalists have been killed since 2000 in Mexico. This guy, Jose Armando Rodriguez, is a reporter for the daily newspaper El Diario in Ciudad Juarez. On November 13th, 2008, he was shot at least 8 times by an unidentified gunman as he was about to drive his daughter to school. He was killed immediately. His daughter, who was also in the car at the time, was uninjured. He had received a text threat on his cell phone earlier in the year demanding that he tone down his reporting on crime in Juarez. His killing occurred exactly 1 week after a severed human head was discovered at a monument to journalists in Ciudad Juarez. So 24 journalists have been killed since 2000, 7 have disappeared since 2005. 8 writers were killed in Mexico in the last year. Who's doing this? It's a difficult problem because it's not the government per se. It's what we call non-state actors, narco-traffickers, criminal syndicates, but there's corrupt police forces, there's an interpenetration of government and non-government agents. It's a huge problem for the international human rights world. Those who are silencing writers now in many parts of the world are not governments. How do we confront them? So that's problem number 1. And that problem was simply made worse by the fact that the United States neglected huge parts of the world for those years, and much of the world, our attention was focused elsewhere. Problem 2 was made worse by the direct confrontations that the United States was involved in. And that's the problem of the argument that's growing around the subject of religious defamation. Do you have the right to write something, to publish something, to say something that offends somebody's religious sensibilities? Do you have a right to do that? That's becoming an increasingly thorny question. You have the Danish cartoons as the most prominent example of it. In reaction to that, now you should think back a minute to the Salman Rushdie case, Satanic Verses, right? In which he was sentenced to death by the Iranian government because what he wrote was offensive to Islam. Okay? Now, we move forward to the Danish cartoons. Since the Danish cartoons, there's been a movement within the United States from the Islamic world to pass resolutions that prohibit religious defamation, that require states to criminalize speech or writing that offends people's religions. That's a concern. And then the third area, the last one, is what I call the new authoritarianism. And that's China, and that's Russia, and this is a really, really troubling model. And I think they're distinct, but they're similar in their aims, which is you can have economic liberalization, but you maintain authoritarian control, especially of media and of information technologies. You're conducting wars on terrorism. Both countries are conducting wars on terrorism, and we were cooperating with them. And part of the problem was that these were our allies through some of the Bush administration. They blame many of their abuses on the fact that they too are fighting terrorism. In Russia, it's Chechnya. In China, it's Xinjiang province with China's Muslim minority. And so you have a problem where Salman Rushdie had a really great quote at a conference I was at with him, where he said, the problem with anti-terrorism is that the dialectic of history is going underground. It's now a struggle between intelligence and terror. And both of those are clandestine, right? They're both underground. You can't see them. So more and more, the forces that are shaping our lives are inaccessible to us. They're both fundamentally anti-democratic. And this is spreading around the world. Very dangerous. In Russia, 74 journalists have been attacked since 2007. 8 have been killed. And in China, of course, I mentioned what's happening to our colleagues. The battleground in China, above all, is on the internet. And I know you'll have a session before this conference is over, specifically about free expression on the internet. It's certainly one of the big battlegrounds. So Hillary's trip and her inability to raise these issues before the Chinese government, I think, really drives home that we're at a kind of a crisis moment for human rights in the world right now. Part of it is because of the way the United States has conducted itself over the last 8 years. Part of it is clearly the economic crisis that we're in, where the United States is now. I mean, I don't think there was ever a more feeble-looking image of the United States than saying, we're not even going to bring this up because we need you to buy our debt. You know, it was really kind of a stunning moment. So I guess, you know, the question I'd leave you with is who's going to stand up for these things? And I think it's us. It's us, first and foremost, all of us as young people, as writers, ourselves, as people who have to sit down every day and get to ask ourselves that question, you know, what am I free to write today? So just with that thought, you know, look for the organizations that are doing this work. Think about it yourself. Think about how it works online, where you spend a lot of your time, and where young people like you all around the world are conducting this battle day to day against their governments. Please fill out these postcards, and please go to the website and sign the petition. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this seminar on a very important aspect of our own lives and being. When Alicia was talking about the voice of the voiceless, the need to recognize that the voiceless have also their own voices, their own agency, which is often hidden under people speaking for them. It actually reminded me of my own novel, Wizard of the Crow, where there is a movement of ordinary people, and the thing they keep on repeating from one end to the other is the question, is a song they sing about recovering the voice that had been taken from them by the dictatorship. I was in fact going to read from the book a little bit, but there's no time, so I'll talk about the freedom to write, you know, generally. Of course, in talking about freedom to write, I must say it gives me great honor to have speak after Larry and Alicia. I'm always beholden, quite frankly, to two organizations, PEN and Amnesty International, because of a personal relationship to them, because when I was once put in prison because of my own writing, PEN and Amnesty International were extremely active in securing my release. Yeah. Now, since we don't have time, I think I better read from a paper I had written some time ago, and I thought it was very relevant to today's discussion. So I'll go to the paper right away. Recently, I've been writing my biographical notes on my life. And one of the things I remember is a debate which me and another student had about writing. Yeah. And I want to start from there. It was a debate about censorship that made me turn to writing. I was 16 in the last year of my primary education, and I had just been introduced to Dickens and Stevenson by one of my teachers. I came from a rural community in colonial Kenya. Books were a rare sight in our lives. For me and my friends who were used to oral stories around the fireside in the evenings, it was quite a discovery that people could actually tell stories through writing. And such interesting stories too, that one did not have to wait for the evening to hear. One could actually read them, as I most certainly did, at any time of day and night, and even under the desk in class during a boring lesson. For me, these writers were a special category of beings. I wanted to join their company. Outside the classroom, I shared my secret desire with one of my students, with whom I also shared books that came my way. And why not? Was his response. It was then that the debate between us began, the debate about which, in fact, I'm writing in my bio. I believed that one needed a license to write, that if one wrote without some kind of formal permission, one would be arrested and most certainly be thrown into prison. If teachers needed training and a certificate in order to teach, why not writers? But my friend had a different view and said that one did not need a license to write, that there was no way one could be imprisoned for writing books. The exchange took place somewhere in 1954, and later, the following year, he and I went to different schools. He went to a teacher training college, and I went to a secondary school. As far as I was concerned, that was the end of our unresolved debate. But my friend never forgot the exchange. And in his first year, his first act was to write a story, which he called a book, in order to prove to me that one did not need a license to write. That was in colonial Kenya, then seething under a state of emergency declared by the British colonial state in 1952 in its fight against Mayo guerrilla struggle for independence. As part of its anti-colonial, anti-nationalist fight, the British colonial state had banned songs, dances, books, and newspapers that were deemed to be on the side of the independence movement. Although this did not become apparent in our debate, I think my own concerns may have been derived from that environment of censorship. My friend never, of course, went beyond the first chapter, but he had made his point. He had not asked for anyone's permission to write his unfinished book. Although he never finished the book, he did complete his training program and became a licensed teacher. Most important, he was not arrested and imprisoned for his unfinished and published book. Now, I was to recall that particular debate when the police of an independent Kenya came for me at midnight on December 1977. Their first act was to raid my home library. They collected any books with the titles that bore the words socialism or politics. But what seemed to make them happy was their seizure of my typescripts of the play Gahikadeda, I'll Marry When I Want, whose license to perform at Kameredo Community Education and Cultural Center, Limuru, my hometown, had been withdrawn by the state 6 weeks earlier. The debate kept recurring in my mind when I was stripped of my name and any rights to books and writing material at Kamete maximum security prison. All incoming and outgoing letters had to go through a prison censor. Under those circumstances, I could not help but reflect on censorship and the free circulation of ideas, recalling the debate my friend and I had engaged in 25 years before. We, of course, did not give it a name. We just talked about it at the time. We did not think of it in terms of censorship. It was simply, but our exchange had been about the basic issue that underlies the question of censorship: the right to freely express and receive ideas. Censorship is an act of regulating the shape, form, and content of ideas by a religious or secular authority with powers to initiate and carry out punitive measures in the name of a higher moral good of a group, a community, or a nation. It involves the evaluation of an intellectual product by a set of moral creeds. I remember something I read some time ago at the University of Jena in Germany of the 19th century. At the University of Jena, in accordance with the tradition of a German state in 19th century, one of the rulers proclaimed that what he wanted from the university was not educated men, but obedient subjects. Quite often, the authority is the one that defines the moral creed and moral needs. It becomes the sole judge of the correct relation of the offending ideas and practices to the authorized moral need. The end is clearly to control the conduct and opinions of a community through a regulation of their intellectual diet, so as to bring about conformity to an established norm of political beliefs and ideologies. Censorship becomes the means of containing an opposing view, especially one that seems to challenge an existing view of the desirable moral order. This is well illustrated in a play that I like very much by Brecht called The Life of Galileo, or simply Galileo, Brecht, German playwright, in which Brecht dramatizes the struggles between the Ptolemaic and the Copernican systems. Galileo, with a newly invented telescope, is able to prove the truth of the Copernican system, that the Earth is not the final center of the universe, is not the fixed center of the universe. He returns Florence with the belief that once the Pope and the defenders of the old system look through the telescope, they will be able to see the truth for themselves and hopefully abandon their old belief in the immutability of the earth. Some of the experts look and argue fervently against what they see. Others refuse to look through the telescope. Galileo pleads, "Gentlemen, I beseech you in all humility to trust your eyes." But even that they don't. It is his friend Sagredo who later enlightens Galileo, showing him that censorship has more in common with the fear of truth than the defense of truth. And this is what he tells him: "Galileo, I see you setting out on a fearful road. It's a night of disaster when a man sees the truth, and an hour of delusion when he believes in the common sense of the human race. Of whom does one say he's going into it with eyes open? Of the man the path to perdition. How could those in power live at large? A man who knows the truth, even though it be about the most distant stars. Do you think the Pope will hearken to your truth when you say that he is in error, and yet not hear that he is in error? Do you think that he will simply write in his diary? Censorship, whether carried out by a religious or secular institutions, has its immediate and main objective the prevention of the consumption of an intellectual product in the form of words, exhibitions, or performances. That's why lists of the forbidden become the principal form in which censorship expresses itself. This is also the form that conjures up images of a group of men sitting down in half-lit corridors of power with scissors or pencils in their hand, and now I suppose their hands on the computer, ready to rule and cut out the undesirable word in a newspaper or undesirable image on celluloid, or as I say these days, in a computer, internet. This is a form that is replete with absurdities and comical contradictions, satirized by, for instance, James Thurber's story of the land of the wonderful O, where the letter O is banned from the alphabet. You can see the consequent disaster. Good and God become good, just GD. Orange becomes range. In her paper, Stage and the State, the censorship of Richard II, Ruth Underhill tells of the censorship of parts of Shakespeare's Richard II in the reign of Elizabeth I. All plays at that time had to be approved by a court-appointed master of the revels. 3 editions of Richard II were apparently published without the abdication scene, a phenomenon not dissimilar to that of the censorship of Shakespeare in the reign of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. In a production of Julius Caesar, it was not Brutus who stabbed Caesar, but Caesar who stabs Brutus. For you could not have a monarch with claims to divinity die in the hands of a common mortal. I don't know how the play proceeded without Brutus, yeah. Some of the absurdities arise from the fact that the censors cannot possibly have the time and the stamina to read all the books and watch all the video being produced. In Banda's Malawi, when Banda was a dictator, the censorship board became the main underground distributor of forbidden videos. The members would sometimes take home the juicier videos to show and titillate a trusted few. And of course, The trusted few had their own trusted few. Later, the board imploded under the weight of its own contradictions. To simplify its task, such boards are often guided by key words that become the signal for placing the work on a prohibited list. I suppose these days with the Google, it's easier to, to get the forbidden words. This can result in a censorship board prohibiting a book which is actually favorable to the regime. The South African apartheid regime once banned Anne Sewell's book, Black Beauty, the story of a horse, because of the implication that black could be beautiful. There, the word black was a signal. The Kenyan government, simplified, this independent Kenyan government simplified its task by simply outlawing all books published in Peking. So in the 80s of the last century, we had the absurdity of people being sentenced to long prison terms if they were caught with a text by, say, Einstein, if the book was published in China, particularly Peking. But the same work was presumably harmless if it was published by any of the Western publishing houses. Marx, Lenin, Castro, Mao, published by, say, Harvard University Press, were safe to read. But the same text became revolutionary and subversive if they carried a Chinese imprint at the time. The police who raided my home library were looking for Chinese publications of books that bore any titles with politics, socialism, and liberation. When my novel, Matigari, became known in 1986, people started talking about the hero as a seeker of truth and justice. The Mayo dictatorial regime, thinking that the people were talking about a real life character, sent the police to arrest Matigari, the main character. Later, the regime banned the book when they could not find the character, or rather found that he was only fictional. The absurdity can also come from the victims of censorship. There is a poem by Brecht on the subject of burning books, which satirizes such a situation. The poem tells of a certain regime that once commanded that all books with harmful knowledge be burned publicly. But one of the best writers, one whose works had always been critical of the regime, was dismayed to find that his books were not on the list of those to be burned. And I quote Brecht, he rushed to his desk on wings of wrath and wrote a letter to those in power. Burn me, he wrote with flying pen. Burn me. Had my books always reported the truth? And here you are treating me like a liar? I command you, burn me. In its attempts to prevent the consumption of the intellectual product, censorship can go beyond the legalistic form of lists of books to be banned and banned. Censorship can reach out to the means of realizing the intellectual product. A regime, an authority can bar access to the performance space, as we were told in the case of China, for instance. This can take crude forms. In 1982, the Kenya Moi regime literally locked the Kamirido performers out of the National Theatre, the University of Nairobi, and then outlawed the group. On March 12, 1982, the regime sent 3 truckloads of armed police to raze to the ground the open-air theater built by the villagers. But barring access to the performance space can also take the less crude form of withdrawing public funds for the arts. And you remember the case of Mayor Julian of New York, who really exemplified this form when he threatened to withdraw funds for the Brooklyn Museum because he objected to certain items in the exhibitions. A regime can also bar access to the means for literal production, pen and paper, for instance. I personally experienced this at Kamiti Maximum Security Prison in Kenya, where I ended up writing my own book, Devil on the Cross, on toilet paper, because I had no paper, I had no other paper. But outside the prison walls, for instance, where publishing houses are controlled by the state, the allocation of paper can determine the subject matter for intellectual production. It happened in many of the communist regimes in the East. It happened in many publishing bureaus of the colonial regimes in Kenya, Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, and South Africa, where apartheid South Africa, that's it, where the colonial state only funded the production of books by Africans if the writers shied away from politics. Now, one of the most important means for the production of knowledge is language. The suppression and devaluation of languages is one of the surest ways to prevent the realization of the product of intellect. In fascist Spain, non-Spanish languages, for instance, Euskara, were driven underground. Some time ago, last century, I should say, I was invited to give a few lectures in Basque country, where I was told the most harrowing stories of parents teaching their children the language forbidden by Franco's fascist regime, often risking their own lives to keep their languages alive. When Africans were carted from Africa to America and the Caribbean islands, the first act of intellectual suppression was a repression of African languages. At the assimilation of Hawaii into USA in the 19th century, remember the Hawaiian language was banned until 1978. Oh, okay, 1 minute, okay. The same happened in colonial Africa. The books and newspapers banned in Kenya at the time that I was having that debate were only those writers in African languages. In post-colonial Kenya, the same hostility towards African languages continues. And this, by the way, this phenomenon of languages being marginalized and stopped, is really a global phenomenon, and it seems sometimes invisible. I could say, if you look at the world today, the world is dominated by a handful of European languages, and you can see this, at the United Nations, where only so many languages from Europe are the operating languages in the world. Let me sort of touch on one more form in which a given regime can adversely affect the production of knowledge, controlling the body of the producer. That is when they put them in prison and so on. And this has happened to so many intellectuals from the times of Plato to the modern world. Controlling the body of the producer is not only an attempt to prevent further realization of the intellectual production on the part of the affected intellectual, but also an exemplary warning to the population as a whole. So I just want to mention one more and then I'll end. One could argue that there has always been a struggle between forms of censorship and forms of restless search for knowledge. The biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in some ways exemplifies the struggle. Note that the forbidden fruit is literally the one that grows on the tree of knowledge. In that case, the choice confronting Eve is that between authorized blaze in the Garden of Eden and the risky business of knowing. Yeah. So in fact, that might be in one of the earliest cases of censorship. Now, given the nature of development as a struggle between what has been and what will be, I believe that there will always be a form of censorship between the old, where the old tries to conserve what is, and through the instrument of the state as a centralized authority, and the new trying to reform what is already there. So I would like to end by actually drawing attention to the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I value very much, which says that everyone has the right to the freedom of opinion and experience and expression. These rights including freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media regardless of frontiers. I believe that art, as an embodiment of the possible, is essentially at variance with censorship. Universities are not there to produce obedient subjects, but seekers of truth who subject even the call for obedience to rigorous scrutiny. Universities like this should institutionalize the struggle for the opening of the frontiers of the possible in the enhancement of human freedom, inequality, and diversity. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time. If anybody has questions, I think that there are microphones that are available. It's a great opportunity to speak to such distinguished writers and workers in human rights.
Here's a microphone if you have a question.
Hello, my name is Gerard Morel Cruz. I'm a graduate student in English here. I'm a first-generation American. My family's from Cuba. And I'd like to know what the Penn Institution is doing in regards to the censorship that is going on, the censorship and the oppression that is going on in Cuba for the last 50 years. Thank you.
Well, Cuba is obviously one of the most, the world's leading jailers of writers and journalists. I think the number is around 55 right now on Penn's case list. We are constantly pushing. We have been working on a couple of cases in particular over the last year of a young writer named Normando Hernandez, who's been quite sick and is in prison, and we've been really trying to help him. He's been in a hospital in Cuba, and now he's been sent back to prison. We have a large campaign that's focusing on freedom of expression in Latin America in general that's happening this year and has 3 focus countries, Mexico, Cuba, and Venezuela. A number of the writers who are now in jail in Cuba were part of the crackdown that happened in March of 2003, a roundup of writers that happened just on the eve of the Gulf War, of the United States going to war in Iraq. I think it was kind of, again, a lesson on how neglect from the United States can exacerbate situations in countries where I think Castro realized that the world's attention was diverted elsewhere, and he used the sort of threat of the manufactured threat of U.S. invasion as an excuse to crack down on dissent in Cuba. And a number of those there were 75 writers and journalists and dissidents who were arrested at that time. A number of them had been in contact with the U.S. interest section, and there was allegations that they were receiving support from the U.S. government, which obviously, the support that was given was simply in order to help them exercise their freedom of expression, as Ngugi described it. So, I mean, it's a top priority case. We actually, Penn Canada is one of the leading organizations within Penn in working with Cuba. One of the great things about working in an international organization is that we are able to work in countries where we're most effective. Obviously, it's very difficult for the United States to work in Cuba. The activities of the Penn American Center are propagandized as the Castro government as an extension of U.S. policy. For example, Penn Canada is not stigmatized that way, and they've actually directly negotiated through their foreign ministry for the release of writers who have then been flown to Canada in exile. Obviously, this is not a satisfactory resolution to the problem. A writer should be free to write and practice his profession in his own country, but it's just to illustrate the fact that we're doing everything we can every day. And so we will keep pressing.
Larry, do you want to shout out your website so people can follow through on these
Sure.
issues?
The website is www.pen.org, really simple. There's also penusa.org. You can find International PEN's case list of writers in prison on the pen.org site. If you go to the program button, Freedom to Write, you can find twice a year, International PEN publishes a list of writers who are under threat or in prison around the world. It, unfortunately, is always right around 1,000. Cuba leads the list.
New list just came out.
New list just out, exactly.
Other questions? I think I saw a hand over here. Ken? I'll get you next. Yeah, right here.
Hi, Dan Hellman. I'm a graduate student here in geology. Do you guys watch TV? And what's your opinion of it?
Of TV?
Yeah.
Of what?
Of television.
Oh. Well, like everything else, it is the old struggle between good and evil. It's also there, you know, in television. By the way, what I find very interesting in the modern world is that if you look at technology generally, it has a potential of freeing the democratic space in terms of access to ideas, you know, quickly. There was a time, for instance, when going to orchestra, you know, in Russia, in Europe generally, was the privilege of those who had the money and the cars or carriages to drive them there and so on, or to the cinema for that matter. But with the cassettes and discs and CDs and so on, you know, that technology makes that, you know, accessible to millions, you know. But the same tendency of technology towards expanding the possible also has another tendency to try and shrink the capacity of technology to make that possible through ownership and other patterns of marketing and so on. You find the same thing in television and even now in the internet. You know, the technology in a way enables, you know, great access to ideas, to books, and so on. That's one tendency. But the other tendency is to control that space and try to own it, you know, by special groups, you know, by government or by organizations. So these two struggles are still in there, you know, in television, in the internet, and so on.
I would just say that as a writer, I mean, I find that, you know, that, and one theory is that some of the best writers in America are now writing for television. I mean, I think there's, you know, you look at a lot of the cable-produced series like Deadwood and The Wire and places like that, and there's been a, you know, I mean, there is clearly a pull for, you know, for the mass media, for writers. You know, writers went to Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I think writers are now going to TV. There's a lot of really amazing dialogue writing and story writing going on in television. I think that's, you know, that's different from the question of whether it's, you know, what television news is doing or the dissemination of information. But I think as, in terms of the idea of creative fiction, character, plot, story, dialogue, there's a lot happening on TV. That's, you know.
In my house, the TV control is owned by my husband and my girls. The only great concern that I have had with TV in the past, of course, I get my news on TV from this guy Stewart, no? Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart, right? Exactly.
Yeah, that's how I get my news. And then I am stuck with Law and Order, and I can follow this whole trivialization of torture and this trend to justify ways of, you know, tormenting or violating the law through these programs and you know. But I don't know why you asked that. Why you asked to ask that? I mean, are you writing a dissertation on? No.
What do you think? What do you think of it?
It seems like such a big change.
Oh.
Yeah.
The
Well, it's-
internet, the books are disappearing, and all our books are going to end up on the internet. Whoever wants to read those little thingies, but
I just saw an amazing documentary called This Is Nollywood, and Nollywood is the Nigerian home movie industry, you know, and the television in Nigeria is dominated by these serial, you know, soap operas that are basically shot for $10,000, you know. I mean, you can get a camera, you can get your friends, you know, and you can make a movie and it becomes a series. And, you know, and I think, again, it's a little bit of what Ngugi says. It's like, you know, there is production. There's no question that it is a stage for creative endeavor. And as such, I think it's, you know, no less or more valid than a novel or anything else, you know. And it's obviously in that, at least check out the movie if you get a chance to see it. It's really fascinating, really interesting.
Very good. Any other questions? Yes, up front.
Hello, I'm Patrice Perkins, an alumni of Cal State Long Beach English and Black Studies. And I have two questions. The first one is, do you believe that China's growing influence and involvement in Africa will force the United States to address human rights concerns and open the field up to writers?
So I didn't get that.
That's a really
the
good
rise
question.
of, sorry, there is again. There's echoes, that's why.
Okay. Do you believe that China's growing influence and interest in Africa will force the United States to address their lack of human rights concerns on the continent and open the field up to writers?
Oh, I'm not sure what the problem I see is in terms of trade relationship and the need for economic linkages. I think, for instance, America during the Bush era set a very bad example for many of us. You know, I remember when I was in prison in Kenya a long time ago. It was in the era of Jimmy Carter, who really pushed forward the issue of human rights, you know. And quite frankly, I was a beneficiary of that particular push, okay? But when it became actually like some years ago, when even the question of what one read in libraries could have been used against one in this country, for instance, you know, it reminded me of what was happening in Kenya during my time, when actually what one read in libraries and bookshops and so on was, or even in the classroom, what was often used against them, you know. So the importance of governments, whatever they are, if they can at least have the high moral ground, you know, it always puts pressure, you know, on other governments. And when governments, Chinese, you know, American, you know, have lower their human rights, you know, records or ideals, you know, it has bolsters, obviously, authoritarian regimes in Africa and other Latin, because there's no pressure on them and so on, you know. Whereas what's needed is pressure, continuous pressure by peoples from within. And also, quite frankly, I like the idea when governments question each other's human rights record. You know, I think it's important that they are able to do that, yeah.
I think that's such a great question. I'll just throw in really quickly. I mean, China is actually going around the world right now telling governments and repressive states explicitly, we're not going to mess with your politics at all. We just want to do business with you. So you're not going to have to deal with getting harangued about human rights with us. That's what we have to offer. We're just here to help you make money. We want to make money. That's it. You know, I think it's a real opportunity for the United States because the people of those countries obviously want more. There's a really interesting study about attitudes toward the United States in the Middle East, and it identified the thing that most inflamed the anger of young Arab men against the United States was the publication of photos at Abu Ghraib, because they live in countries that are repressive, that torture people, and even though that they understood, there's a complicated political feelings about the United States, but at least they believed that the United States' commitment to human rights was a fundamental commitment, and seeing that the United States was torturing was apparently, according to opinion studies, the single most disappointing, disillusioning thing in the Middle East. And I think the same applies in Africa and a number of countries. The United States does represent something for the rest of the world. It represents the idea that it is a country that has most clearly articulated these values and has tried to construct a system of government that most generously protects them, and I think the world appreciates that.
Thank you. My second question is, do you believe that pre-colonial literature still serve a purpose in post-colonial literature?
Oh, pre-colonial?
Yes.
You mean the ones written before actual colonial establishment of colonial states in Africa?
Yes.
Yeah, we're talking now the area of what we call orature, or orality, in Africa and other places, by the way, and oral literature, or what's called orature, is still a very, very important force in Africa and in the world, whatever cultures we live in, In fact, by the way, we can, with television and YouTubes and other conversations that are going on the internet, the oral world is coming back in different ways, There's now more orality, or we are even getting oralization of the literary through the internet and YouTubes and what do you call these things I see my daughter always texting, I went to Hawaii with my daughters, sort of, and everywhere we went, she was always sort of then what are you doing? Oh, I'm sending pictures of what we are seeing. In other words, whatever we are seeing in Hawaii was being instantly experienced by her circle of friends, through the text messaging. They were having a conversation, literally. And even the words they express now, I was like, I was talking with my friends. Then how are you together? No, messaging or through other means, yeah. So the oral world is really coming back. But oral literature, or orature, is still a very important force in the world. In fact, I don't theorize about this, but when any national literature or cultures are exhausted through whatever, a breakthrough comes when they try to reconnect themselves to the oral or folk traditions of the people. Then there's a new blood, as it were, into the literary system or cultural system of that nation. Yeah.
We might have time for another question. Anybody else? One more? Great.
My name is Nelly Gaswitz, graduate student from the Spanish department. And my question is to Professor Perney. You, Professor White Tiongo, as a result of your exile, we get to enjoy your books that have been published here in the United States. But my question is, how can we get what has been done to approach the survivors that are still, for example, in Argentina, Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo, to have their work published with no interference from editing? Otherwise, we will have a case like the Rigoberta Menchú case. How can we approach, what has been done to approach those survivors in Argentina, for example, to get their work published and have it distributed around the world?
The survivors are writing a lot these days. It's been 30 years since the military coup, the dictatorship. So only 2 years ago, my book, The Little School, was published in Argentina. It was written in Spanish 20 years ago, and it circulated in the world before. So at this point, the most difficult thing is to first, not to so much to publish in the country, but to translate those works and have them published outside. The industry is in crisis at this moment, and the publishing industry in the States is in crisis. It barely publishes the writers here, and it is closing more and more the doors to whatever is coming in translation from abroad, especially from non-writers, you know, the non-professional writers. So the works are there. I mean, if you're willing to translate work, gonna take your card, and you know, we approach publishers, small publishers. I'm part of a writers co-op, a collective that we just created called What Books, and I'm planning to translate into English works by them and publish them here. But that's just done on my, you know, little means. So whatever, you know, it's a work of solidarity, truly. It's not gonna be easy. I mean, they only want one book. I mean, Jacobo Timmerman's book. My book, I got very fortunate to have like 20 years, this publisher that has been loyal to me and has been reprinted it, but it's been kept alive by people in the departments in English and women's studies. I mean, so if there is demand to study them in your classes, if you're gonna, you know, if you teach them, and that's the way of opening those doors. It's a very, you know, it's an effort, like a little grain of sand here and there.
Well, this has been a fascinating panel. The talks were excellent. I wish we could continue this discussion and dialogue, but I want to thank the panelists, and I hope you'll have the chance to participate in some of the other activities of the President's Forum. Thank you very much for your